said I can't do 10 years.
He was on the run until suicide closed the case of Nick Bissell. But fugitives tend to face a different fate, even more time in prison to pay for their flight. Fugitives up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.
For as long as there have been laws to break or crimes to be accused of, there have been fugitives. You'll find them in the Bible, in the history books, and of late, on the front page of your paper. Nick Bissell was among the most dramatic cases ever, the tough prosecutor turned convicted felon whose flight had a fatal finish. I'm Raymond Brown, and on this edition of Due Process, the practical and psychological points of life on the run. We'll meet a lawyer who's defended fugitives and a bounty hunter who's pursued them. But first, here's Sandy King with a special report on flight before Bissell.
Raymond Bissell was just one of the more outrageous examples of a public official gone bad. That is, until he ran. Then he joined the ranks of an even smaller club, those who just can't face the music. Looking at life behind bars for a decade, Bissell, like those before him, took off. But unlike most of them, his path didn't lead back to prison.
For several minutes, the marshals attempted to negotiate with Mr. Bissell to persuade him to surrender peacefully. Despite their best efforts, Bissell killed himself by shooting himself in the head with a handgun in his hotel room.
And so ended Nick Bissell's flight from justice. Not with arrest, but with suicide.
He was clearly facing not just a year or two in prison, but a substantial amount of time. And I don't think you can underestimate the impact that has.
Mike Chertoff is in private practice now, but in his years as U.S. Attorney for New Jersey, he had lots of experience with high-profile fugitives.
I wasn't there when Friedland was convicted the first time. I convicted him the second time.
That was 1988, 2 years after former State Senator David Friedland faked his death while diving in the Bahamas. The flamboyant Friedland had been facing a lengthy prison term for looting a Teamsters pension fund. So he took off, eluding capture in a 2-year chase that led agents from the Bahamas to East Africa, from the French Alps to Hong Kong, and finally to the tiny Maldive Islands off the western coast of India.
He was a guy who, had the arrogance and the cunning to convince himself that he could be a successful fugitive, and he was successful for a period of time.
Why are you afraid? What are you afraid of?
And even so, wound up within a couple of years afterwards getting caught.
Today, he's still in prison, and time does tend to run out for most fugitives, where their freedom lasts for only hours, as it did for O.J. in the Bronco chase.
Well, if you got a passport and you're in a vehicle leaving the area, it's pretty obvious you're not thinking of taking a vacation.
Or if, like John List, the fugitive manages to forge a new identity and stay lost for nearly 2 decades. List was long gone when police found his family, his wife, his mother, and his 3 children, all slaughtered in their huge Westfield home.
I feel that due to my mental state at the time, I was unaccountable for what happened.
And perhaps he would not have been caught if not for a TV show that recounted his ghastly crime in a reenactment, showing him as he'd looked back then and as he likely looked 19 years later. A call from someone who knew him as Robert Clark, a married resident of a small Virginia town, finally brought John List to justice. He'll stay in prison for the rest of his life.
I mean, List is a guy who, was a fugitive for years. And it was through that television show he was ultimately apprehended and imprisoned. So, that's a development which didn't exist 10 years ago and which has turned out to have a real impact on flight.
In fact, America's Most Wanted, which had once used Nick Bissell to try and catch a fugitive, most recently told the tale of Bissell's own flight and of his suicide in the Nevada hotel room where U.S. Marshals had him cornered.
Here at the Colorado Bell Hotel Casino, the U.S. Marshals trapped him in room 374.
The former prosecutor, who had faced 10 years in prison, had eluded authorities for just 10 days. But Eddie Antar stayed free for nearly 2 years, fleeing a probe that would finally lead to charges of racketeering and security fraud for skimming millions from his Crazy Eddie chain. When he was finally caught in Israel and brought back in chains, it was Mike Chertoff who brought him to trial.
Are you happy about the verdict?
And at his trial, Antar's flight was used against him.
When we tried Crazy Eddie, we used that flight evidence, and of course we had additional evidence that he had passports and he had in fact taken steps to move money overseas as he was in the final phases of carrying out his stock fraud.
And though Antar's conviction was eventually reversed, he later pleaded guilty to lesser charges and is still in prison today. In fact, the vast majority do get caught, though there are a few famous exceptions to that rule, like Joanne Chesimard, who had been serving life for a state trooper's murder when she broke out of prison with the help of 3 gunmen.
I guess she's supposed to be in Cuba. I mean, that's the example of someone who is able to become a fugitive because they can draw upon, in that case, an entire country.
And she even wrote this book from there. But the one-time Black Liberation Army leader, who's been among the most wanted since the late 1970s, fits Chertoff's profile of what it takes to successfully run.
Unless you've got some real organization behind you, like an organized criminal group or some political group, you need a network of people. And without that kind of network, ultimately you're going to be caught.
And Chesimard had a network of true believers who at first hid her underground and later got her to Cuba.
She's more or less in a large prison now. And, it may not be a problem for her in terms of her own beliefs, but it's very hard to be free as a fugitive. And, her, quote, success as a fugitive is a function maybe of her willingness to accept a different kind of confinement.
In fact, for fugitive financier Robert Vesco, refuge in Cuba has of late become prison in Cuba. Vesco's fortune kept him free for decades, but just this year, his luck and maybe his money ran out. He is still in Havana, now behind bars. But David Friedland, whom Raymond represented and I covered at trial 16 years ago, reportedly has about 6 more months in a federal pen in Colorado before he gets a shot at a halfway house. And as for Joanne Chesimard, Assata Shakur, who remains the one apparent success among the high-profile fugitives, one can't help but wonder what becomes of her if Castro is finally forced from power in Cuba. And Raymond, if she's brought back here, I wonder if it still stays in the family. It was your dad who represented her at trial last time.
Wouldn't surprise me if he relished the challenge of representing her again. And ironically, I tried my first murder case against Nick Bissell more than 20 years ago. And when we come back, the next president of the Criminal Defense Bar in New Jersey and a real-life bounty hunter to talk about why they run, where they go, and how they're caught. Stay with us.
He just then mentioned how hard it was to do what he was doing. He said, "You have no idea how hard it is to be alone. I am utterly alone. It's awful." He asked me if the feds thought the note was a phony. And I mentioned that Faith Hochberg had been giving press conferences where she had stated that. A rueful, amused laugh in a way. He said, that note's no phony. They got a surprise waiting for them when they come get me. And he said, "There's no way I can do 10 years. I've tried." I said, "Boss, don't do that. Think of your kids." He said, "I know." And he just said, "I can't do 10 years."
That's how Bissell explained his flight and his suicide. But no one wants to go to prison. So why do most do their time while only the few take off? How do they manage? Why are they almost invariably caught? For some answers, we turn to Brian Neary, an attorney who's represented fugitives and who is the president-elect of the New Jersey Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and Marion Sanders, who as a real-life bounty hunter makes his living chasing and catching fugitives. Brian Neary, let's turn to the case of Nick Bissell, somebody that we both knew. You had worked with him. Were you surprised by both his flight and what happened at the end?
A double tragedy and a double surprise. You figure that someone who understood the system well enough, one would realize that they're going to get caught. And
you're a criminal defense lawyer. Are you saying that criminal defense lawyers don't want their clients to run?
No, not at all. You don't want them to run for your own ethical problems as well as your own ability to represent the client. You don't want to have to argue at a sentencing someday, not only the double whammy that he or she's been convicted of the crime, but then they either didn't have the courage or had the arrogance to take off, so that the day that you could be hopeful to get a sentence that would be worthwhile is thrown away when somebody flees.
And the reason you have that concern is that most who run get caught. And that brings us to you, Marion Sanders. But before we talk about that, I'm curious as to whether people really understand that you're a bounty hunter, because I think most people have the illusion of a guy with 6 guns in the Old West with a big scar across his face as a bounty hunter. How do people respond when you identify yourself as a bounty hunter?
Very surprised. Mostly most fugitives are always looking for police with the uniforms and the dogs and the whole 9 yards. But when I approach them and I tell them that I'm a bounty hunter, they are totally surprised.
Now, Nick Bissell's flight unraveled because he made a phone call to his wife, and his wife told the authorities. Do you normally start with the family when you're looking for somebody?
Mostly I do. Me personally, I like to go straight to the ex-girlfriend.
Why the ex-girlfriend?
Well, normally in some cases they have animosity or whatever reason why they broke up, and they would just tell you exactly where the individual is at. If it's a female fugitive, then I go directly to the mother or the father, brother, sister.
Let's, Brian, talk a little bit about Nick Bissell's situation. Apparently, the person who alerted the authorities to his presence in Nevada was his wife. She was also facing sentencing. Do you think that may have factored into putting some pressure on her?
Well, in the federal sentencing guidelines, which are very strict without very much discretion for a judge, this may have been Mrs. Bissell's one opportunity to not only soften the judge's heart in essence that she has learned her lesson, but to find something legal and technical that will allow her the advantage and give the judge the opportunity to give her something less than a rather draconian kind of sentence that the guidelines were going to call for.
What we know is that the marshals confronted Nick Bissell in his hotel room, and Bissell took a gun and blew his brains out. They've been criticized because Bissell, in fact, did leave a suicide note before he left New Jersey. Is that criticism fair in your view? Should they have been more delicate or approached it differently, or what would you have done?
Well, it's kind of hard to make that decision if he was not there. Me personally, I probably would, depending on how much information that the marshal had. If they knew that he was at a particular place, then there should have been a different way to go by arresting him.
But you must have had people you were chasing who had suggested to somebody that I'll die rather than go to jail or something like that. Would that have affected your pursuit?
Me personally, no.
So you chase him no matter what?
I'll chase him. I'll hunt you down and I apprehend you.
Do you care whether the person's dead or alive?
Well, morally, yes. But, I would love to take him alive. It's an unfortunate situation with that particular case. I prefer bringing him, walking him in just like I'm walking in.
But what about the old expression, dead or alive? In fact, can you collect your bounty if the person's dead?
Yes, I can. There have been several cases where I have I went after a fugitive, did the investigation, learned that he had died, and just get a copy of the death certificate, and then my office or myself will get paid. Me personally, I love when the person walk in with me. No incident, nobody's hurt, we walk in.
Brian Neary, let's talk a little bit about the lawyer's role. In fact, a lawyer can't counsel his client that he should flee. Can the authorities come to a lawyer and say, listen, Brian Neary, your client just fled. Tell us everything you know about him.
It is a very uncomfortable position for a lawyer to be in when the client flees, because then the lawyer themselves almost become a target of the investigation. There's this unspoken suspicion that the lawyer may have counseled the client rather than to face the music to take off. The lawyer's obligation is not, I believe, is to protect the attorney-client privilege. And the information that they may or may not have is something that they should jealously guard. Hopefully, the client has not confided, and often the client will not confide in the lawyer. It's usually as much surprise to the lawyer as it is to the authorities. But it's the trick when the client calls you back after they've become a fugitive and said, I've been a fugitive, help me to get back into court.
Can the authorities come to the lawyer and say, tell us about that last call he made to you on the run?
They can. The question that becomes, how far can the lawyer protect the client? New Jersey Supreme Court.
I was going to say, this isn't just theoretical knowledge. You actually had a case in which this issue arose.
I represented a lawyer whose client had fled, who 5 years later hears from the client. The lawyer then turns and calls the prosecutor and says, the client has called me. Can we work a plea bargain? The next thing the client knows, or the lawyer knows, he's got a subpoena to appear in front of a grand jury to testify as to the whereabouts.
Ultimately, what did the Supreme Court decide?
The Supreme Court said that there is an attorney-client privilege. It is not absolute, and in certain circumstances it may be pierced, but law enforcement has to do something, has to seek an alternative means, has to look in other places before they get to this most sacred form of communication and try to invade that.
So there may come a day when our Supreme Court might rule that a lawyer has to go in and give up some information about where a client is if he knows.
In a civil case, without a doubt, they have to do it. In the criminal case, because there's the protection of the Fifth Amendment, or the Sixth Amendment, the right to counsel, you really want to encourage somebody, if they're on the run, to seek legal advice. And the correct legal advice by a good criminal defense lawyer, come on back, I'll walk you back in. Maybe we can get a bail, or maybe we can get a sentence that'll be somewhat worthwhile. But if they pick you up, if a bounty hunter, or worse yet, a police officer gets you, forget about the chance of being able to walk you out the back door.
Now, Marion Sanders, let me ask you about some of the realities of life on the run. In fact, I would think money would be an example. I mean, we talked about David Friedland, Robert Vesco, and other men who obviously had some resources. There's some reason to believe that Nicholas Bissell was trying to raise money in Vegas by gambling. Do people who have resources, who have money, have a better shot of staying on the run than those who don't?
That is correct. Individuals who have access to money or have a large sum of money would most likely will be on the run much longer than someone who don't have it.
What else does a person need to do if they're on the run to evade detection besides have a lot of money if they can?
Well, actually, you should play a low profile. I mean, I'm not trying to tell a fugitive what to do.
No, we're trying to educate our viewers as to what you do.
Well, if a fugitive on the run, the number one thing he should do is play low profile. Actually, the fugitive is
Give me an
living.
example of what you should do if you're low profile. What does that mean?
Well, wherever you're hiding, stay.
Okay.
Wherever you're hiding,
Don't
stay.
get involved in public life.
Right. Don't hang out. Don't do. See, what a fugitive do. The number one problem that they have is that when they're living a particular lifestyle, and when they become on a run, they want to continue living that lifestyle. Most fugitives, 9 out of 10 fugitives that I went after, become a fugitive and go right back to the same spot where they commit the crime or where they lived.
And also, and unlike E.T., don't call home.
Don't call home.
Okay. Now, Brian Deary, there was a fairly famous case in New Jersey, a man named John List, who was actually captured by virtue of a television program, but that's after he had lived for 20 years in another part of the country, in Virginia. But he seems to have been a guy who kept a very low profile despite being wanted in connection with 5 murders.
And assumingly, it took a different identity. He lived a whole new life. Now, there's a question, does the passage of time reform somebody for the evil deed that they did 20 or 30 years ago? Has the passage of time said, in essence, they spent their time, their life on the run? Sometimes the enormity of the crime itself, as in List's case, 5 murders, the enormity of it, time will never solve that. And at the same time, no one will ever give up looking for a person with a crime who's committed one as serious as that.
Now, I don't want to... What were you going to say, Brian?
No, I was disagreeing with Mr. Derrick.
Now, I don't want to imply that you've faced a lot of sentencings with your clients, but the fact is, isn't it kind of amazing the number of people who do show up and face sentencing even when they may be looking at a lot of time in jail?
I do. Sometimes it's strange, but and in crimes of violence in today's society, there is less of an opportunity for that person who faces a sentence because the bails are so high. But I think people learn to reconcile themselves to the fact, in essence, they're going to do the time, and there's something on the other side of the other side of the fence that they will eventually get out. A gentleman like Mr. Bissell of Friedland, is there a sense of arrogance that they are not only within the system, but so far without the system, whether before the crime or now after the crime and after the conviction, that they will always beat it? And that's the person, I think, who was the runner.
We also might talk about help. We certainly know, for example, that there's a well-known case in Connecticut that's about to go back for a second trial. A man named Brian Kelly, who was abroad, Alex Kelly, who was abroad for 10 years, apparently with the help of his parents, as it's been reported. A case in Delaware recently of 2 young people charged with killing a young infant as it was born, and at least the lawyer said that the first reaction of the mother was, what can I do to help my child in terms of flight? Do you look to see whether there are people helping somebody who's a fugitive?
I normally do. number one, you have to understand, a fugitive do not want to go to jail. They would do anything and everything they have to not to go, especially if they know that they're going to do a certain length of time. So they would go to the family members and ask them what to do, or for some type of expensive support to get them wherever they go. Fortunately for me, and unfortunately for them, wherever they go, again, I go.
Okay. Well, let's go back to the family issue. It can get complicated, as, for example, with Nick Bissell, his mother had posted her condo as security, as effectively securing his presence. It's kind of tough to expect your family to help if they're going to be losing their homes or other property as a result of your leaving.
Well, the question that families ask when they're asked to post a bond, a substantial bond for their relative when they are first arrested, will I lose my home? And the answer really is you won't lose your home or your asset or your life savings unless the person flees.
But by the way, legally, when does the forfeiture occur?
The forfeiture occurs at the issuance of the warrant. Because the person later shows back up doesn't mean that everything is forgiven, you get the money back.
So sometimes you could even voluntarily turn yourself in, and your cousin's house or your aunt's house may be gone anyway.
Well, hopefully that there is some measure of the complicity. Did the person who put the bond up, should they suffer this drastic consequence just because they were helping a loved one? But at the same time, there's a great risk if your loved one for whom you're posting the bond isn't a person of high moral character.
Let's talk about one of the other realities of flight, which is where you go. We talked about Ashada Shakur, who is in Cuba. We talked about Vesco, who's in Cuba, Dave Friedland, who was abroad. Does it help if people have enough resources to get out of the country?
Yes, it is, to avoid the arrest. Yeah, I would say yes.
And is it more complicated? For example, as a bounty hunter, you've been in almost all 50 states? Or?
Well, yeah, I go all over the country, but there is certain, for instance, Jamaica. We have no
You're not going to Cuba, though?
No, not at all. And we're not going to Switzerland either.
Okay. So are there any other countries where it's more complicated if you run? For example, people tend to think there's a cliche about going to Mexico. Does it make a difference, or is it that you're in more trouble if you stay than if you leave the country?
Well, it is more trouble when you leave the country because, of course, you have that charge going across state lines to avoid prosecution. You have to understand, bounty hunters and law enforcement officer is not on the same level. There's things that bounty hunters can do that law enforcement officers can't. For instance, I had apprehended an individual who was in Mexico. Okay, I paid members who lived in Mexico to bring the person to me on the Mexican line.
So that you can take steps and go over some lines that law enforcement won't go over.
Right, exactly.
And of course, do your neighbors, do most of the people that you associate with who are not involved in law enforcement or the criminal justice, do they know you're a bounty hunter?
Some do.
I guess more do now.
Yeah.
Brian, you were a prosecutor before you were a criminal defense lawyer. Do prosecutors forget about people like Joanne Chesimard in Cuba, for example? I mean, is there still somebody kind of working that file, waiting to see if she comes back, and maybe even taking aggressive action to get her back?
I think that in a high-profile case with a high-profile defendant or an enormous crime, that they don't give up. As a prosecutor, I had a lawyer who was pursued all the way to South America, and we got him and brought him back.
Over how long a period of time?
He was away for maybe 2 or 3 years. We finally got him and brought him back. It's interesting. It's the more mundane, the ordinary cases. It's not just the famous who run. Sometimes ordinary citizens who are charged with crimes that aren't all that serious run. They don't send out bounty hunters to get those people, usually, and they don't have an all-points bulletin where the FBI and all state law enforcement gets involved in the pursuit.
Well, how do they live, Brian? Baron, do you know how people live who are ordinary folks who don't have huge amounts of money? How do they survive when they're on the run?
Well, see, now, getting back to what you said, it's depending on the charge, if they send the local police or FBI, I mean, if it's a violent crime, of course they want that particular person back in. So it's depending on the crime that they do.
But for example, if a person is living on the lam, are they more likely to have to engage in illegal conduct to live? Can they get jobs? How do they survive?
They're going to have to. Some cases where you're being sought out very strongly, you have to sell your drugs or do illegally things in order to survive, to maintain your status as being a fugitive.
Brian Neary, what's the most important thing you would tell a client of yours who is on the run?
Come in as quickly as possible. Let me bring you to court. If the case hasn't been finished yet, I might be able to get set a bail for you. If you're going to be sentenced, at least I have the argument that they came back voluntarily and we don't have to face that double whammy. Not only the crime, but you compounded it by running.
If they run Marion Sanders and you're on the case, what's the likelihood that you're going to get them?
2,000%.
You're saying you haven't missed anybody?
Only but the two individuals who died before I got to them.
Okay. Now, is that because you're the greatest bounty hunter around, or is that generally true that if you're a fugitive and there is a bounty hunter following you, they're likely to catch you?
That is true. I feel as though that I'm a very good bounty hunter, and I actually apprehend you once I get the case.
And what's the critical, most important part of your success?
Just to be careful.
Be careful of?
Fugitive.
Fugitive. Okay. Well, are you often in danger when you're chasing somebody?
Well, yeah. It's again, they don't like going to jail. They will do anything they have to do. They will fight. They will try to hurt you, harm you or your associates, in order to get away from you. So, you have to be very careful.
Marion Sanders, I want to thank you for being with us. Brian Neary, always a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you.
And that's it for this edition of Due Process. But we hope you'll join us next week when we take a look at how a law strikes closer to home. Divorce is on our docket for next time. Till then, for Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown.
Seems easier to people when they're confronted with the reality of going to jail to think about, going to Tahiti and sitting on a beach. But when you think about what it means to reconstruct a life in only one of a limited number of countries with very little in the way of resources, no possibility of gainful employment, unless you've got tremendous wealth and some protector who's going to make sure that people don't prey on you, I think ultimately you wind up having a very miserable existence.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.